There are lots of ideas on how to do this, but it has to be part of a coordinated.
Innovative and determined, he is a man with a mind to transform Africa's vast resources.
I came to realize that there's a new tool that could actually empower Africans to diversify their food base.
His mission is to find a scientific solution to the continent's agricultural problems.
And the purpose for conservation is so that future generations can benefit from those crops.
This week on African Voices, we meet the esteemed author, professor, and conservationist Calestous Juma. With a sunny disposition and a shock of white hair, Calestous Juma is hard to miss. A beloved professor at Harvard University, he's also one of the most recognizable voices in biotechnology and sustainable development. For 3 decades, this Kenyan-born scholar has been raising the profile and practicality of biotechnology. But his love and passion for science was inspired by his local fields.
I was interested in the conservation of African varieties of crops. Particularly, I was studying fruits and vegetables of the slopes of Mount Elgon in Western Kenya. And I started to run into older people who had collected seeds of fruits and vegetables, mostly fruits, that had disappeared. And some of them explained to me that those fruits have disappeared because the area dried up. And they would pose a question to me and say, you scientists, are you able to make these fruits grow in places where there is less water? So that's what got me interested in genetic modification, because answering that question couldn't be done using conventional methods of breeding. You actually needed to find traits for drought tolerance, because you're going to be growing these same crops in places where there is no water. And these are crops that used to grow along rivers. And as I started to think about the potential for genomics, and that was in the late 80s.
At the time, revolutionary work was already underway in genetic engineering.
What scientists found out exactly 30 years ago and demonstrated scientifically is that you can transfer those traits from one plant to another, and what that plant was doing can now be done by a new plant. So if a plant was resistant to, say, high temperatures, and if you transfer those genes to another plant, that plant also becomes resistant to high temperatures. And that started to open up new industries, because you could then start to design organisms to adapt to new places. And that started to create a basis for basically building up new industries. And that's what has happened primarily in agriculture.
How transformative can biotechnology and its applications be in Africa?
Highly transformative, because African agriculture is stagnated over the years. One of the reasons is by being in the tropics, farmers encounter so many different challenges: pests, drought, floods, decline nutrients. And what is happening with this new technology is that you can now empower plants to resist pests. And that has huge implications for agriculture, because the farmers don't have to buy pesticides, many of which are in fact toxic. Some are in fact carcinogenic. And so you end up growing crops at a lower price, but also reducing the negative impacts of using chemicals. And this is being done quite in a number of African countries.
This path of research led him to international acclaim. In 1989, he authored The Gene Hunters, which set him apart in his field.
I published my book 7 years before the commercial release of genetically modified crops in the United States. But my motivation came from local people wanting scientific solutions to their problems. That's what motivated. I came from environmental conservation. I had been mentored by the late Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai on conservation. That was my interest. And the purpose for conservation is so that future generations can benefit from those crops That's what motivation for conservation was about. And then I came to realize that there's a new tool that could actually empower Africans to diversify their food base. Not only do that, but be able to resurrect crops that had disappeared or adapt their traditional crops to new conditions.
One country that's benefited from the use of genetically modified crops is Burkina Faso. Ranked 183 of 187 countries and territories on the Human Development Index, the West African nation is also one of the world's poorest. For a country heavily reliant on growing cotton, or white gold as the locals call it, the introduction of GM crops in the past decade has been completely transformative.
This is a country where the cotton industry had virtually collapsed because pests had developed resistance to all known pesticides. And the current president came in and said there's a new technology we can use that can help us to revive the industry. So the first application of it was reviving cotton in areas where the industry had collapsed. But that has also opened up possibilities for new farmers who have come in and have expanded cotton production. And we've seen significant improvements in the income of the cotton farmers. The country has been able to see the prospects of reviving its agriculture beyond cotton to a point where they are now even thinking about establishing a regional cotton university to help train people in all aspects of industrial activities associated with cotton, all the way from agronomy to basically manufacturing to textiles. So Burkina Faso is a good example of how this could become really transformational for all types of farmers, both large-scale farmers and small-scale farmers.
I wouldn't have thought Burkina Faso was spearheading the revolution in biotechnology in Africa. What is it that makes that so? Is it, again, a commitment of leadership?
Leadership was very important in the case of Burkina Faso because the Economic Commission of West African States, ECOWAS, had adopted a decision basically imposing a moratorium on the cultivation of genetically modified crops on the assumption that they would be catastrophic for the environment. And the leadership of Burkina Faso went to ECOWAS and said, if we are not allowed to adopt this technology, which is essential for our revival of agricultural system, we are going to withdraw from ECOWAS. And it was that pressure that led ECOWAS to exempt Burkina Faso from these restrictions. And Burkina Faso moved on to start growing GM cotton. So leadership is absolutely important in this respect.
What can lure leaders to invest more in biotechnology beyond their own commitment?
Leaders have to be responsive to the needs of the population. And that's what happened in Burkina Faso. We had a leader who came to power and was under enormous pressure to improve the living conditions of the people, and agriculture is the starting point.
Juma hopes it can be a new beginning for a troubled industry. Coming up, the inspiration that drives Juma to take on some of the continent's biggest problems.